The monk Jiaoran, looking for Lu Hongche, but not finding him at home. Although your new place is near the city walls, the path to reach it goes through mulberry and hemp. The chrysanthemums you planted by your fence, though autumn comes, have not yet shown their flowers. I knocked at your gate, but no dog barked, so I had to ask your western neighbor. He told me you had gone into the mountains, but returned each day under the setting sun. So this is the last poem of the 5-word regulated verse that are included in this anthology. The next day we will start the 7-word regulated verse. This is also the only poem in the anthology by Jiaoran, and it feels slightly misplaced because chronologically Jiaoran is not a late Tang poet. He is a between High Tang and early Middle Tang poet. Basically, his period of highest production is in the immediate aftermath of the Anlushan Rebellion, the 750s, 760s. A couple of things to say about Jiaoran and about the anthology. So first of all, this anthology, as we've mentioned many times, is pretty Catholic. I mean, it includes different types of writers and different types of styles. But if I would have to point one glaring absence, or rather a downplaying, it's poetry by monks. So during the Tang and later, there was, a big amount of poetry written by Buddhist monks, and not only Buddhists, some Taoists as well. But and some were very good. I mean, Jiaoran we will talk about him in a minute, but he's a pretty prestigious writer. There were others like Qi and a couple of others who are very important monk poets and who appear in other anthologies. But monk poets don't get much of a place in this anthology, perhaps due to maybe Confucian prejudices against explicitly Buddhist figures. Anyway, who knows? Jiaoran. So as I said before, Jiaoran was a monk, a Buddhist monk. He lived mainly and produced in the middle years of the 8th century. He roamed a lot of the Chinese Empire, but mainly lived in the southeastern area at the place where the Yangtze joins the sea. And he spent some time there, and he formed a coterie of sorts with other literarily and intellectually inclined scholar officials. So in that circle that he had in the lower Yangtze area, two important figures are Yan Chengxing, who was a military governor, had been a general during the Anlushan Rebellion, who was a very good calligrapher. And he also had a very close relationship with Lu Yu, alias Lu Hongche, the person about who he is writing this poem, who was also a scholar official. I think he didn't pass the examinations. He is famous for his leisure and enjoyment, especially of tea. In fact, he wrote a book, Lu Yu, called The Cha Ching, the Classic of Tea, which is probably the first book that intellectuals wrote about and seriously about tea drinking. And it's very interesting for learning about the tea culture during the Tang Dynasty, which would be very different from the tea culture in the Song Dynasty, which was the one that was later taken to Japan and through a religious process of transforming cultural activities into religious activities became the source of the Japanese tea ceremony, Sado. Anyway, going back to Jiaoran, we said he was a monk, he was an intellectual, he wasn't a scholar official because being a monk he didn't run into affairs in the government or try to pass examinations after becoming a monk, but he participated in the local culture of the southeast, and apart from being a producer of poetry himself, he was a student, a literary critic, one of the early literary critics. He wrote various pieces of literary criticism, including an anthology, which have been partially preserved today. And his reputation, I think, during most of classical Chinese history was as a literary critic, above all, even more than as a poet. So fragments of these pieces of literary criticism of his, the Shi, the Shi Pin, they have been preserved. We talked about Japan when we talked about the tea ceremony a minute ago. Most of his literary criticism has been preserved in the works of a Japanese Buddhist monk, Kukai, who at the beginning of the 9th century went to China to study esoteric Buddhism and retrieve Buddhist scriptures, but also cultural artifacts from the prestigious Tang Empire. And one of the books that this monk Kukai, the head of the Shingon sect of Japanese Buddhism, one of the texts he wrote when he went back to Japan was a book called Bunkyo Hifuron, which is a study on literature and on literary production. And we know that a lot of what appears in the Bunkyo Hifuron is extracted from monk Jiaoran's texts. Also, another curious thing, monk Jiaoran, that was his name when he became a Buddhist monk. But he actually was, his original surname was Xie, and he was allegedly a 10th generation descendant of Xie Lingyung, the Duke of Kangle, one of the greatest poets of the period of disunion and the founder of the tradition of mountains and rivers poetry, landscape poetry, called Shanshui. And in fact, in his literary appreciations, he very much defends the sort of poetry that was made in the South during the period of disunion, which was a poetry that was condemned as decadent and excessively ornamental during most of the Han Dynasty. In fact, in his literary criticism, he defends a type of poetry very much in the style of the High Tang poetry, and very much similar to the poem he presents us here. That is a poetry that is not apparently too artificial or contrived. It uses rhetorical figures and metrical and phonic elements, but it tries to make them feel as natural as possible, as uncontrived as possible. And then we have this in this poem that we're going to comment here. So looking for Lu Hongche but not finding him at home, already from the title, clearly fits in with a genre or a subgenre of Chinese poetry that we've already encountered in this anthology. Searching for the monk or the hermit and not finding him at home. It's a subgenre that we've talked about. Generally, this typically runs like this. A scholar official, during perhaps a day off or a period of relative holiday, goes to somewhere near the capital to visit a hermit who is living in retirement, to converse, to experience the pleasures and the intellectual interchange with hermits who, in a lot of cases, were as schooled and scholarly as the scholar officials themselves. And this trip to see a scholar is also generally a bite-sized or a pill-sized experience of the hermit life for a day, which scholar officials always, at least a big number of them, always yearn for as an alternative to the grinding rat race and the petty miseries and sometimes the cynicism and the dangers of serving in office. So a scholar official always wants to serve in office, but he always gets frustrated with office invariably because either he is not recognized or appreciated as he thinks he should be by the emperor, or the experience of realpolitik is found by the scholar official to be in jarring contrast with the ideals of a Confucian rulership that employs no violence, no harsh laws or punishments, that is meant to persuade people just by virtue. And, Confucian political theory is a bit too idealistic. Even though Confucianism was the state orthodoxy in China from approximately the Han Dynasty until 1911, in practice it was really tempered by a great degree of legalism, which was another of the philosophical schools of the Warring States period, which was a more like hands-on, practical, slightly totalitarian view of government, which emphasized that rulers should resort to punishments and severe laws and rewards, carrot and stick, and that, the government should be all-controlling and all-powerful. Incidentally, and we're moving away from the poem, Chinese communists and Mao particularly made a vindication of legalist politics, and in a contemporary reinterpretation of the Chinese tradition, they generally equated themselves with the first emperor, Qin Shi Huangdi, who had been a very strict legalist, and with the legalistic philosophy of strong state power and suppression of any dissent, and especially antipathy towards philosophies like Confucianism, especially also Taoism, that put the emphasis on moral behavior and on freedom. Okay, so back to Monk Jiaoran's poem. We were saying this is a typical exemplar of the searching for the hermit and not finding him at home. In those poems, there's generally the conclusion in which the hermit is not found, but the writer of the poem seems to feel, or at least pretends, to have anyway learned a valuable lesson just by being in the surroundings of the hermit. He has sipped a little bit of the retired life, and he has assimilated the spirit and been partially influenced and given part of the message and the pleasures of the retired life. And sometimes it goes in the form of, even though you weren't here, by being in your surroundings, I have learned a lesson about being detached from the world and searching for truth. We don't have that in this poem. That's it. The main way in which it differs from those examples of the not finding the hermit at home type of poetry. There's a poem which is much simpler, quite descriptive, and so it fits with those ideals of simplicity that we just mentioned for Monk Jiaoran, and that appear in his literary criticism. Okay, so as usual, let's take a look at the poem couplet by couplet. First couplet. Although your new place is near the city walls, the path to reach it goes through mulberry and hemp. So in the first couplet, Jiaoran is going in the direction of visiting Lu Hongxian and his new hut, or the place of retirement where he dwells. It's a new place, and it's just outside the city walls, so it's interesting. It's not in the city, and therefore not in the world, you would say, but it's not that far away. It's just a little bit beyond the city wall. So just like those hermits that take refuge in the Hongxian mountains near the capital, they were out of the capital, but within relatively short walking distance from the world of rulership and politics, which means that scholar officials could very easily go and visit them occasionally. So beyond the city walls lies Lu Hongqian's hut. The path through it goes through mulberry and hemp, so this is a rural area, or at least a place where you can see signs of peasant cultivation. The hut is surrounded, or is near a path that goes through mulberry and hemp. Mulberry and hemp were two plants, tree and a plant, that were cultivated a lot by the Chinese peasants. So Chinese peasants cultivate things for eating, which in the north is mainly millet, wheat, and different types of millet and some other cereals. In the south of China, it was mainly rice. But they also cultivated things for paying taxes and for wearing clothes. Mulberry was cultivated for silk. So the mulberry leaves are the main or the only diet of silkworms. And hemp, on the contrary, makes a rougher fiber that was the basic material used for clothing of the lower classes. So this is a rural area, and there's a nice contrast between the city walls and the mulberry and hemp. Yeah, the place where Lu Hongqian is a liminal place. It's out of the city but close to the city, and even though he apparently is living a hermit-like life, it's pretty close to agriculture. It's not just in the mountains. No, it's in the area of cultivated fields or close by to it. Second couplet. The chrysanthemums you planted by your fence, though autumn comes, have not yet shown their flowers. So as usual in these poems, we get a zoom in. In the first couplet, we were just getting near the abode of Lu Yu, going from the city walls, passing through mulberry and hemp. Now we get to the entrance of the hut, what we get is the fence, and it's described through descriptive detail. There are chrysanthemums decorating the fence. Chrysanthemums are a very popular flower in China, and they're a symbol of late autumn, early winter, because that's apparently the time in which they flower in China and in Japan, in very late autumn. In fact, one of the late autumn festivals, 9th day, 9th month, is the Chrysanthemum Wine Festival, where people drink wine infused with chrysanthemum leaves. With chrysanthemum flowers, with the petals. So there are the chrysanthemums in the fence. It's autumn already, but it's probably not that late in autumn because the chrysanthemums haven't flowered yet. So not the 9th month. Yeah, perhaps we're in the 7th month or the early 8th month. And we were at the fence, so we haven't yet entered the hut. The next couplet again includes a non-entering, but now there is no entering the hut because there's nobody in. I knocked at your gate, but no dog barked. So I had to ask your western neighbor. Jiaoran reaches the gate, he knocks, he sees no sign of life inside. So evidently Lu Yu is away, so he goes and talks to a neighbor. He says, hey, where is the hermit? And the last couplet is, it's not a summary of the whole poem really. It's, the answer given by the neighbor. He told me you had gone into the mountains, but returned each day under the setting sun. So this is not really a summary or a lesson to be taken on the retired life by Jiaoran, but it does synthesize this retired life of his friend, of Lu Hongxian, which is of course held as an ideal or an aspiration for any scholar official. The friend goes into the mountains probably for religious meditation or practices, or perhaps being an avid consumer and practitioner of tea rituals. He probably goes to fetch water, fresh water, or tea, flowers, and plants and leaves, and brings them back. So every day he goes out into the mountains, but every day when the sun sets, he returns back to his hut. So there's this cyclical moving between the mountains and the hut that in a way echoes the movement we've had in the poem from the city to the hut. So the writer of the poem, Jiaoran, goes from the urban life and from the world to the hut. And the person who dwells in the hut and is not there moves from the hut and into the mountains and then back. So, yeah, quite a nice poem in its tradition. Quite fresh, quite simple. I imagine it fits well with the 300-tongue poems and its pedagogical intent, because at least in the translation, it's a pretty simple poem with no very difficult conceits, no allusions, no apparent allusions, at least no very literary or hard to pick up allusions. So interesting, pretty simple, pretty limpid piece, probably imitating and continuing that high tang style which Monk Jiaoran so much praised in his critical works.